All right, we're back for section 7. We're going to talk today about the death penalty, which is always a very controversial topic, especially here in the United States. Um, First, we can talk about kind of the history of the death penalty and some famous instances of it throughout the history of the world. In the ancient world, there was the death penalty was nearly universal. Um, it hasn't been until much more modern times that we've developed concepts of things like imprisonment. If you read, say, the Code of Hammurabi or any of those other ancient codes, a lot of the crimes were punishable by death. And the nature of how that death was to be carried out varied in a lot of different ways. One famous instance of the death penalty being used in the ancient world was Socrates, the famous philosopher. He was a Greek, and he was tried and convicted of corrupting the youth, um, teaching people philosophy and morality and all those things was considered bad back then. So he was convicted of corrupting the youth, and they made him drink poison. And there's actually an ancient painting here of this ancient scene where this is him kind of going nobly to his death and drinking this poison, and so it was kind of a self-administered execution. Vlad the Impaler, this gentleman here, was from a place called Wallachia. It's kind of in modern-day Romania area. And he's actually the guy that they based Dracula, the vampire character. He was the historical figure that character was based on. And he had a reputation for really, really liking to impale people. And this was essentially impaling. If you have a sensitive stomach, you might want to mute this for the next few minutes. But with impaling, you take essentially a spear, and it goes in through kind of the bottom of the body and up through the torso and out the shoulder. And they got pretty good to where they could do it without killing the person. And then they would just, be suspended there on this giant spear until they did eventually die. But that could take hours or days. And he impaled so many people that he became kind of famous for it. It was very disturbing imagery when you were approaching his capital city, because he would put the impaled people on the road as you were approaching as a kind of a warning to not be a criminal. In Rome, of course, the Romans had capital punishment lots of different ways. Crucifixion, made famous through the Bible, was one of the ways that they used the death penalty. And there were multiple different versions of crucifixion, multiple different ways it was done kind of physically. This kind of demonstrates a few of them. And then samurai. Samurai had a very interesting kind of non-legal execution system where if you kind of dishonored yourself and your family, then you would be kind of sort of sentenced to execute yourself, but it was expected that you would do it yourself, not that you would have it done to you by the government or sentence passed down on you to be given the death penalty from above. It was kind of expected that you would do it for yourself. And this is an ancient I don't know, picture or painting or something showing one of these samurai self-execution instances. In Europe, though, right up until the 20th century, the death penalty was really, really, really common. In the UK, in that 60-year period, they had 36,000 executions. So it was a very, very common way to give punishment in the criminal justice system. But most of the world, as of this recording, most of the world has abolished the death penalty. They've gotten rid of it. They no longer use it. The earliest one we know of was in 1764 in Tuscany, which was a region of what is now Italy, but back then was independent. Tuscany got rid of the death penalty because of the book on deterrence written by Beccaria, which you might remember from one of our earlier sections in this class. And then in the late 19th century and all through the 20th century, more and more countries got rid of the death penalty. And it's usually done fairly slowly, like they'll get rid of the death penalty for everything except, murder and treason, and then they'll get rid of it for everything except just treason, and then it'll be basically never used, and then they'll finally get around to getting rid of it for good. But one of the things that I find really interesting is that this is a picture of the last public execution in France. It was done in 1977. It was a public execution by guillotine in the Kingdom of France, and while that was happening, Star Wars, the original Star Wars, was in the movie theater, which, you think of executions by guillotine and Star Wars being from two completely different time periods, but no, they actually had a public execution by guillotine while Star Wars was in the theater in 1977. In the United States, has a long history with the death penalty. It's always been legal in at least parts of the United States. There was a peak in the 30s. There was a crime peak in the 30s. There was Prohibition, the gangster era, all that stuff that you see in movies. And then it started dying down and was being used less and less. And then in 1972, there was a Supreme Court case, Furman v. Georgia. And in Furman v. Georgia, the Supreme Court, they didn't really say the death penalty was unconstitutional. They said the death penalty as it was done then was unconstitutional. And they laid out some things that states would have to do if they want to continue to use the death penalty. So states went back and they made changes. And in 1976, there was another Supreme Court case, Gregg v. Georgia, where the Supreme Court said, okay, with this new system that you've devised in the last 4 years, with these safeguards you've put in place, now it doesn't violate the Constitution. And so executions started going up and up and up again. And as you can see from the graph right there, there were more and more executions up until there was a peak in the late 90s, which is very similar to the kind of trend line of crime itself. If you look at overall crime or violent crime, there was this peak in the mid to late 90s, and then it's been decreasing ever since. So executions have gone along with that overall trend. The question is, which is causing which? But one of the changes they made between 1972 and 1976 is that the only crimes you can be given the death penalty for in the United States, in the states that have it, is capital murder. And capital murder is not just regular murder. So you can't get the death penalty for rape or any other crime besides murder, but not even just all murders, just capital murders. And each state defines capital murder slightly differently. But in most states, in order to become a capital murder, it has to meet, it has to be murder plus one of, this list of aggravating factors. In a lot of states that have capital punishment, still capital murder is distinguished from regular murder if you kill a law enforcement officer, firefighter, EMS person during the course of their duties. If you kill a child under, a certain age, depending on the state. If you kill more than one person. If you kill somebody while trying to escape from prison, right? So you have to have one of those aggravating factors, which differ from state to state, in order for your murder to become a capital murder and even become eligible for the death penalty. 21 states out of 50 have abolished the death penalty. It is no longer legally allowed, okay? And there's a map right there of the green states are the ones where the death penalty is no longer allowed. And as of this recording, the most recent one was New Hampshire. New Hampshire just got rid of their death penalty a couple months ago. In addition to that, there are 10 states that essentially don't use it. Like, it's legal there, but they haven't had an execution in the past, like, 10 plus years. So there's only really about 19 states that really use the death penalty. Texas is usually the leader in the nation on number of executions, but mostly around the South. The Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, those kind of areas. That's usually where the number of executions are the highest. So how do we go about carrying out the death penalty? Well, in the ancient world, there were lots of different methods. We talked about how Socrates drank poison. The Romans had crucifixion. Sometimes it was as simple as, being banished from the city, where, the elements would eventually kill you. But in the modern day, there's lots of different ways that this has been done. Probably the most common in the last few hundred years has been hanging. Hanging is essentially, if you look at the picture right there, that is a hangman's noose. And it used to be with a hanging that you would die through suffocation. The rope would close around your neck, you would be hanging by your neck, and thus you couldn't breathe, and it would take you a few minutes to suffocate to death. That became more humane when they figured out that they could use hanging, and then, the reason this platform is a few feet off the ground is because they put the rope around the condemned's neck and then open a trap door, and they fall 3, 4, 5, 6 feet and then get caught up at their neck, and that breaks the neck and kills people instantly, usually. If they fall too far, their head can come all the way off, which was considered uncouth. If they don't fall far enough, their neck won't break and they'll strangle. Stoning is also a very common way of committing the death penalty, all the way back to the ancient times, all the way up to today. There's still some countries in the world that use stoning today. Stoning was made famous in the Bible, where Jesus comes upon a woman about to be executed via stoning, and picks up one of the rocks and says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Right? So essentially saying, why are you killing this person when none of you is innocent? In medieval times, one of the more common ways to do executions was with a sword or an axe. You would hire an executioner. The king or the noble of the area would hire an executioner. And they would, the condemned would put their head on a stump or a block of wood or something, and the executioner would take the head off, which was thought to be a clean death. But one of the problems was the executioner didn't always get a good, clean hit at the right place with the right power to behead the person. So there were some times when executions by sword or axe went wrong. The person wasn't killed with the first blow. It became very bloody, very messy, very kind of horrific. So again, you'll notice a theme here. To become more humane, a guy in Europe developed the guillotine, which is this contraption right here, where it's essentially the same as the beheading by sword or axe, but with a machine rather than an executioner having to aim and hit the right place. This person developed this blade that comes down with a weight on it that is kind of sure to hit in exactly the right place with enough force to take the head off in one blow. And this was kind of famously used during the French Revolution, when the poor, kind of the poor and middle class of France rose up and killed many of their rich and noble leaders, um, including famously the king and queen at the time, Louis XVI, I think, and Marie Antoinette. Um, Another fairly common one since the invention of the rifle has been firing squad. And this is done in a few different ways, but usually the condemned is lined up against a wall or a tree or something, and a squad of men with rifles, sometimes 5 or 6, sometimes up to 10 or 12, each aims at the person. A coordinator kind of says 3, 2, 1, fire, and they all fire at the same time, and the person is thought to be instantly killed by that many bullets. The One of the things I find interesting about the firing squad is that what they'll usually do, or what became common to do, was to give one of the people firing the shots during the execution a blank. So one of those rifles is loaded with a blank, and nobody knows which one it is. But that gives the people who pulled the trigger the kind of moral escape of, oh, it wasn't me that killed him, I'm the guy that had the blank, so I didn't kill him, and kind of assuages their guilt for having shot this person by having that one random blank round somewhere within those rifles. The electric chair, again, hanging was the common method in the United States, and it was a dentist, in fact, which, when you think execution, you think dentist. A dentist invented the electric chair, where essentially, the condemned is strapped to this chair, electricity goes through their body, it's enough to kill them. And that from the 1920s is when that started. That became the preferred method of committing executions in the United States. Then the gas chamber was thought to be more humane than the electric chair, because the electric chair it didn't always kill quickly. There were some people who had to be electrocuted for 5-10 minutes, and even then they might not be quite dead yet. So the gas chamber was invented as a way to be more humane than the electric chair, where essentially you're sitting in the condemned sits in a kind of a sealed chamber with windows so people can see, and they're tied to a chair similar to the electric chair, and then that chamber is sealed up and made airtight, and then some pellets of chemical get dropped into a liquid of other chemical, and that creates this gas. The person breathes in the gas, and that kills them. But once again, that the math was not always perfect, so it caused botched executions. So we move to lethal injection. Once again, a way to seem more humane in our carrying out of the death penalty. And that's currently by far the most common method of execution in the United States, and in a lot of other countries in the world that still have the death penalty. But it's still not perfect. There are still instances of botched executions. There are still instances of people going through horrible pain before they die, or surviving too long, or just other problems and cruel outcomes with this method of execution that is supposed to be, if each step represents a more humane approach than the last, then this is supposedly the most humane way on the list, but it still has a lot of problems. But every state in the United States that still has the death penalty, which I think we said a couple slides ago was 19 of them, 19 of them, in all 19, the lethal injection is either the only option or at least one option. But there are some states where it's not the only option. There are some states where gas chamber, electric chair, firing squad, and hanging are all still options for the death penalty in those states. Um, so it's while it's by far the most common method of execution in the United States, it's not the only one allowed by law. We're going to go ahead and stop there, and I'll see you in the next subsection.